Again, I'm thrilled to be here, to be there, even if virtually, and I'm truly sorry I couldn't join you in person. Unfortunately, I had some health issues that prevented me from coming to Warsaw. And also sorry for these technical glitches. They have been hopefully resolved. So, the chronology is a bit skewed now because logically my presentation should have come before Igor's. But just keep in mind the 20th century post-war context, and let's try to come back to the early phases of Bessarabia's emergence on the map. So I will try to be as brief as possible and to focus on three aspects that I posit are interrelated here. On multi-ethnicity, on colonization, including, internal colonization. I'm not sure I'll have time to speak about that, but still, and especially on province building on the Russian imperial periphery in the early 19th century. So to begin with, the region that came to be known as Bessarabia starting from 1812 was part of a larger borderland area, or rather frontier, comprising the principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia, which were situated between three empires. And I would venture a hazardous, I would say, comparison between the Polish case and the case of the Moldavian Principality, not of course, in the sense of the concrete imperial policies that were pursued there, because the differences far outweigh the similarities, but especially regarding the three-way imperial experiences that befell, so to say, or that that existed in this space that was divided starting from the late 18th and early 19th century between the Ottoman, the Austrian, and then the Austro-Hungarian, and the Russian empires. So the Moldavian Principality, before its partitions, was part of the complex frontier region of the Pontic steppe, which was characterized by unstable relations between the nomadic and sedentary populations, by inter-imperial rivalry, and I emphasize here the Russian-Ottoman imperial rivalry, but of course, there was a lot of Russian-Austrian imperial rivalry as well, although not so much in the 18th as in the 19th century. And I would also emphasize the importance of imperial population politics, and including state-sponsored and spontaneous colonization, for the fundamental shifts in the demographic makeup of both Bessarabia and Bukovina, which is the northwestern part of the Moldavian Principality, attached to next to the Austrian Empire, starting from 1775. So these processes are really connected quite closely in the sense that province building, colonization, and multi-ethnicity are both products and dilemmas of empire, as I hope to show using the example of Bessarabia under Russian rule. But it is important to from the outset to keep in mind that these dimensions are closely linked. Bessarabia was undoubtedly a product of empire. It had no territorial precedent whatsoever, or rather, it had several, as again I will try to explain presently, before it was carved out of the Moldavian Principality to the north and the Ottoman possessions to the south. The history of this borderland during the long 19th century, that is from 1812 to World War I in this case, could be, and this is related to the construction of space directly, of course, could be viewed from a threefold perspective. And this is directly linked to the kind of borderland, the type of the borderland that Bessarabia was. So firstly, one should emphasize that Bessarabia had a transitional space in the Russian Empire. It was, of course, the southwesternmost province in terms of territorial expansion of the Russian Empire. During especially its, let's say, first 2 decades of its existence, Bessarabia was a transitional space between the empire's western peripheries and the colonized expanses of New Russia. And this notion of spatial dualism that I'm talking about here does not only cover this intermediate character of the province itself, so between New Russia and the empire's western peripheries, but it was also reflected on the administrative and, so to say, policy level, not only on the symbolic and space construction level. Because on the one hand, we had the northern and central part of the province, which were mostly inhabited by a Romanian-speaking peasantry, and were consequently more attuned, at least in the minds of Russian bureaucrats, to the empire's western borderlands in these first 2 decades of province building in Bessarabia. On the other hand, in the south, which was reclaimed from direct Ottoman control, the empire pursued a vigorous policy of colonizing and bringing in settlers, both from the south of the Danube, Bulgarian and Gagauz ethnic groups, and from the German countries. So not to speak about Jewish migration, which was significant already in the 18th century to the region. So in a sense, one could say that Bessarabia had this dual duality of space inscribed in its formation right from the beginning. Another perspective that defines sort of the Bessarabia's borderland status and its status as a province of the Russian Empire during the 19th century concerns 2 alternative concepts of imperial space that were applied to Bessarabia. The first one, which was predominant during these first 2 decades I alluded to above, roughly from 1812 to the mid-1830s, privileged the direct gaze of imperial agents, imperial dignitaries, and otherwise imperial observers to Bessarabia. And this direct gaze was represented through the direct travels of these Russian empire builders to the region. And I will give you just 3 examples in order to understand how these travels were directly related to the changes in the region's status. Whereas in the second half, especially from the 1840s, but most emphatically in the second half of the 19th century, Bessarabia started to be seen from the point of view of an abstract, impersonal perspective of modern bureaucracy. And it slowly became a regular Russian gubernia, though never definitively. So reverting to this early concept of imperial space, one could not emphasize enough the role of the personal factor here. And there are 2 personalities, well, 3 if we count Tsar Alexander I himself, who defined these spatial parameters and the conditions of spatial construction of Bessarabia during this early period. The first is the famous Russian diplomat and then Greek leader Ioannis Kapodistrias, and the second is the no less famous Prince Mikhail Vorontsov, who shaped both New Russia and the Caucasus later as viceroy. So, just to, again, to illustrate this, how important this personal factor was for the oscillation of Bessarabia's symbolic status within the Russian Empire in this early period, one should say that every one of these 2 and 3, if we count the Tsar as well, 3 persons who visited Bessarabia at different points in its crystallization as a Russian province also defined its symbolic belonging. So Kapodistrias was associated with conceiving of Bessarabia as a showcase province, as a model province for the Balkan peoples. So his gaze was from the south of the Danube to the north, as it were, the direction. The second scenario of Bessarabia's symbolic belonging is associated with Tsar Alexander I, who visited the region in 1818, just when the first statute, permanent statute of Bessarabia was being drafted, or was being implemented rather. And for Alexander, during his travel, his trip to Bessarabia, this region was associated with the western borderlands, not least because he was coming directly from Warsaw, where he opened the session of the Polish Sejm. So again, this direction of the imperial vision is quite important for conceiving Bessarabia's place within the empire. And Vorontsov, for his part, who became viceroy of New Russia and Bessarabia starting in 1823, was squarely conceived of this region as part of Novorossiya, of New Russia, of this expansive colonization and settlement, foreign settlement. So these, of course, these personal vectors of these dignitaries do not explain everything, but they do account for the fact that Bessarabia's status sort of oscillated from this refuge province for Balkan peoples during its first years to a part of the western borderlands during the next decade or so, roughly from 14 to 1823, more or less. And then for its symbolic shift to a part of the New Russia, Novorossiya space, after Vorontsov takes the helm of this region in 1823. Moreover, so aside from these from this shift in its early phase in the Russian imperial, let's say, imagination, which was also quite fraught with the discourse of Orientalism, with exoticization, especially in the first decades of its belonging to the empire. During the second half of the 19th century, Bessarabia again shifted its symbolic status, but this time not so much within the empire as a result of what I call the symbolic competition between the Russian Empire and the Romanian nation state, which transformed Bessarabia in a directly contested borderland. True in the realm of discourse more than actual policy, but still, Bessarabia became, starting from the early 1860s, reclaimed by the Russian imperial project on the one hand and by the Romanian national project on the other, which sort of reignited, re-imbued this periphery with a problematic character, with a contested character within the Russian space. Even within Bessarabia, during this period of the second half of the 19th century, things were not so simple, because aside from the bulk of the province, which remained under Russian control, there was also the case of southern Bessarabia, which I'll only treat rather cursorily here, which which was in 1856, as you can see here. So southern Bessarabia reverted to the Moldavian Principality, and southern Bessarabia is important, as I alluded to above, because it was exactly this region of foreign settlement, mostly in this case the Danubian colonists' settlement. This is a rough map of the new border that endured for 20 years between 1857 and 1878 in southern Bessarabia. So the geopolitical status of the province was not resolved even during the second half of the 19th century. The southern Bessarabia, with its composite multi-ethnic population, although it only comprised 1/5 of the territory in terms of surface, it was important again for the Russian imperial discourse of civilizing mission, of progress, of cultivation of this previously desert, not quite desert, but still territory. So its oscillation between Moldavia and then the Romanian nation state and the Russian Empire was again a problem for Russian empire builders at the periphery. And moreover, the Romanian nation state had itself to deal with the privileged status of the Bulgarian colonists, who preserved a certain degree of self-government and were quite unhappy, especially in the early period, with Romanian rule, although things got a bit more accommodating later. I don't have time to dwell on this anomaly of the Bessarabian, southern Bessarabia, just to point to the fact that southern Bessarabia remained an anomaly even after it reverted to the Russian Empire in 1878 as a result of the Congress of Berlin, which this time was expressed in the institutional status of this province, because strangely enough, the Russian government left southern Bessarabia sort of under its Romanian institutions until World War I. Well, it is a complex issue to explain, but it's mostly derived from bureaucratic inertia, institutional rivalry, and all kinds of inconsistencies in the Russian imperial policies regarding the borderlands. And very quickly to revert to the connection between the Bessarabia's symbolic status and its institutional and administrative makeup. So after these first two decades of oscillation between the Balkan region, symbolically, the Western borderlands and New Russia, one could see a definite tendency towards integration of the region in the empire, towards the abolishment or the curtailment of these features of local peculiarity. And one of these very important stages in this normalization of Bessarabia as a more or less regular Russian province was the abolition of the border and quarantine on the Dniester River in 1830. That is almost 2 decades after it became a province of the empire, because the Dniester until that time was still regarded as the actual border for all intents and purposes between the lands controlled by the Russian Empire and the lands that were not quite Russian, so to say. After 1830, as you can see from this list, the measures to integrate Bessarabia squarely and definitively into the Russian imperial space got underway, and the 1830s are quite important as well for rebuilding the provincial capital, Chișinău, which acquired in a way the traits of a colonial city, because we have a European central part of the city and the so-called old town, which was preserved in a state of, let's say, lack of modernity, right? So this spatial division between the imperial city and the old town was, I think, one of the most salient and clear characteristics of a colonial element in Russian policies in Bessarabia, although it is, again, quite debatable if one can speak about Russian colonialism as opposed to colonization in the Bessarabian case. Maybe we can discuss that a bit later. Okay, so again, even in this second part of the 19th century, when Bessarabia, especially in the era of the Great Reforms, ostensibly became a sort of regular Russian gubernia, this intermediate position of the region between the empire's western borderlands, which more or less were claimed for the ideal Russian core, and the alien peripheries still persisted. And this factor of southern Bessarabia, which I briefly discussed above, also contributed to this persistence of Bessarabia's status as a borderland, despite its sort of more and more unambiguous integration into the Russian imperial space. Okay, and very quickly, since I'm afraid I'm running out of time already, I would just present here somehow so that you can have a palpable view of what multi-ethnicity meant in the late 19th century. So this is basically the Bessarabia's ethnic makeup, according to native language, of course, during the 1897 census. And according to this, as you can see, according to these data, Bessarabia was indeed one of the most ethnically diverse peripheries of the Russian Empire, also with a quite diverse population in terms of literacy and the urban-rural divide, which I did not show here. Okay, and multi-ethnicity, and this will be, I think, my concluding remark. Multi-ethnicity was thus both a product of empire and one of the most important and let's say problematic aspects of managing Bessarabia as a periphery. And of course, the example of the 1903 pogrom comes readily to mind. But not only, because also Bessarabia as a region in the early 20th century already during a time when it was contested by the Romanian nation state, also was one of the most active provinces in the western part of the empire in terms of producing visions of Russian nationalism and radical right-wing policy as a response to the fledgling mobilization of the Romanian national movement after the revolution of 1905. And these two figures, Krusevan, I think needs no introduction for anyone familiar with the Russian Western borderlands and the pogrom, and Serafim Chichagov, the archbishop and then the metropolitan who headed the Bessarabian church from 1908 to 1914, really represent the impact of Russian right-wing policies and Russian nationalism on the periphery, as it was radicalized and made even more exclusionary by the perceived threat of separatism and of, in this case, pan-Romanian nationalism. So in a way, Bessarabia has a curious evolution in terms of symbolic, and these are really my conclusions, has a curious evolution in terms of its symbolic status within the empire. So in the first 2 decades, it oscillates between these 3 scenarios I outlined at the beginning. Then it sort of administratively and institutionally is integrated into the imperial system, but due to the Romanian challenge and to this anomaly of southern Bessarabia, of the Ismail region that Igor also referred to in his talk, Bessarabia never quite sheds this mantle of a problematic Ukraina, a problematic borderland, despite the fact that, for example, the introduction of the zemstvos in the 1860s and the legislative reforms that are introduced here, along with the great Russian provinces, seem to indicate that it really becomes a regular Russian gubernia. So it remains a borderland, only it shifts the type of this borderland status, and this borderland identity really shifts in the second half of the 19th century. Thank you very much, and sorry if I took up too much time. I tried to be as efficient as possible. Oh, okay.
Thank you, Professor Cusco, for your interesting bringing Bessarabia as a point, as a case or study of peripheries of the Russian Empire in the 19th century. Now it's time to start our Q&A session, and we have approximately 20 minutes. I think I propose just to gather several questions and then ask our distinguished presenters to address them. So first, let's start from Professor Kuremia.
I have one question and one comment. One is for Igor. We know each other, so I may have heard the answer from you, but it's striking that Moldovans died 10 times, proportionally speaking, or not proportionally, in absolute or proportionally speaking, yeah, than in Russia. That's quite striking. If so, I wonder if in today's Moldavia there is a movement to recognize it as some kind of Moldavian Holodomor, just as the Ukrainians have this strong movement to have Ukrainian famine recognized as a Ukrainian national genocide or Holodomor and so on. So I wonder if there is any movement. One comment for Professor Cusco. Yeah, yeah, no, because anyway, yes. It's certainly interesting that Russian radical exclusionary movement was strong in the periphery where separatism was strong. That's quite, I think, quite common. Черносотенцы, those Black Hundreds, they were stronger on the periphery in Ukraine too, because the Ukrainian separatism was becoming a threat, and in reaction, Russian sort of right-wing movement gets stronger. So I think a Moldavian case, Bessarabian case is not an exception, but there is something common there. And I'm not quite sure about Transcarpathia. That's also quite strong. I don't know about the right-wing movement, but traditionally, because of Hungarian and other issues, there is quite strong pro-Russian sentiment. So these are sort of peripheral phenomena common to many regions.
Thank
Just
you
a comment, yes.
Thank you, Professor Koromia. Now it's Kertész Murphy, please.
Hi, I have a question for Karsten. I was very interested in this idea of the Baltics as Nasz Zapad, and I wondered, because you kind of ended the story in 1940, how this played out in the sort of post-war period. And I was thinking of two trajectories. On the one hand, you know, Zapad in the Cold War is bad, so that would be perhaps suspicious if it's Zapad. But on the other hand, we have all these stereotypes, for example, of Germans in the Soviet Union as being the most productive. The Niemieckie kolchozy are always seen as, like, you know, the model kolchozy and so on. So I wonder if perhaps there's similar stereotype about the Baltics, that they somehow work better or they're more productive or something like that. Thank you.
Do we have other questions?
Thank you very much. I have a very short remark and question. Professor Bergman, before panic of German influence, it was panic of Polish influence, Polish plot, Polski Zagawor. My question is, from your point of view, how important was the experience of Russian struggle with Poles, with Polish question on the western borderlands, western peripheries, in the case of Baltic question? Of course, this is problem of exchange and connections between methods and strategies between among many peripheries, of course, in 19th century. Thank you.
Any other questions? We have 3 voices, so I think it's time to go in our order of presenting. So, Professor Brugman, please.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Hi, Andrei. Nice to see you, at least virtually. I would first like to make a comment also to Professor Koromia's question, because it's the same in the Baltic region, right? I mean, you have the high point, the high period of the realization in the Russian general opinion about the Baltic periods that all these civilization practices, missions are a failure, right? During the time of the first Russian Revolution. This is exactly the time when also in the Baltic case, right-wing Russians who lived in the Baltic province at that time produce amazing utopias of how this region could be really finally Russianized, Russified, with the migration of millions of Russian peasants to the Baltic, for instance. And it's then the Russian administrative elite in the Baltic capitals that say, no chance, it's too expensive. And please imagine a Russian peasant has to be in competition with the local Estonian and Latvian peasants. No chance. So here we have again this stereotype you mentioned, Kertész, in your comment, right? That the German kolkhozes in the Soviet period worked better and harder than the Russian ones. And this is also this long-term stereotype of people coming from these northwestern borderlands, or western borderlands is used for another region, but geographically still the northwestern borderlands, including Finland, of course, in the imperial discourse, who work harder and better. So here we have this long line of continuity producing this kind of positive image of the region. The Russian struggle with the Poles, how important was it for local people in the Baltics? How did they perceive this struggle? Or how important was it for imperial politics?
I mean, experience of Russian imperial bureaucracy. For example, I remember that the main goal of famous submarines, Oкраїни Росії, it was to explain how to Russify Baltic province, but submarine never ended this series. The last few volumes must touch Polish question. Submarine linked Polish and Baltic question. This is interesting. The problem of influence of experience from one borderland on the another borderland. It was not far away from.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting topic. I mean, if you look for the Baltic German perceptions of this parallel, they would always claim that we are the better subjects of the Tsar. The Tsar has no reason to complain about us because we are the true subjects of the Tsar. They had a big problem with being called Russians, right? They never wanted to have anything to do with Russians, but they were subjects of the Tsar and they were proud about it. And so you have also quite a lot of officers of Baltic German origins who fought in the wars against the Poles, and they had never any idea of being solidarily with the Poles. Bureaucracy is also an interesting matter because it also has, if you look at bureaucratic writings on the Baltic provinces from the Russian point of view, it's mostly almost about religion, right? It's this Protestant region in the Baltics, and the Protestants are being regarded to be, how to put it, more realistic in a way, right? Not so prone to be somehow emotionally overcooking or something like that, to be ready to fight against the imperial structure. So the general perception was that this kind of religion made the people, how to put it, to be more loyal, yeah. And you have also an aspect that was not so much reflected in Russian bureaucracy, but reflected in local texts. It's Protestantism, right, that makes people literate, much more than Catholicism or Orthodoxy. So these regions were really set rather against each other, but they didn't really make these kind of parallels. The Baltic region was the more peaceful region and the more loyal region. Andrei.
Professor Cusco, please.
Me? Thank you for your question. Actually, it's a very interesting and important question. You know, there is now a movement, you know, fighting for or promoting the idea that, you know, we should have in our center of national identity discourse the famine of the post-war years, more like in In Ukraine, you had that with Holodomor. Yes, it's in center. It's in the center of national identity, and it's in the center of this discourse during the war with Russia. Yes. Me as a scholar, I don't want to contribute to this kind of competition, victimhood. You know, who suffered more. I just want to explain that, and then others would, you know, would do their job. Let's say I want to be as balanced as possible as a scholar. I don't want to feed this kind of competition, you know, because there is a competition between Holodomor and Holocaust and so on and so on and so on. I don't think this is our job, historians, to you know, to intensify, to accelerate kind of this competition. But my aim is to publish a book in English, first of all, for a foreign audience, and I think this is why I decided to write it in English, because English is giving you also a kind of distance from the country and language and identity you are belonging. You know, it's giving you this kind of American Anglo-Saxon kind of view. So you are looking through other eyes within your own kind of history. What Karsten said, and Kertész actually asked, you know, it's kind of a paradoxical, you know, the Baltic republics were perceived as the West, but during the Cold War, the West was understood basically in pejorative terms. This is a contradiction, but this works today as well. The Russians are hating the West, but also loving it, you know, a lot, you know, kind of very attached, very, and they're imitating it. You see on the, you know, so it's a kind of complicated relationship with the West. They hate the West, but at the same time, they think they are better than the West, you know, in terms of fashion, in terms of film, and they are more original. They put soul in that, yeah. And the whole kind of modernization of the Russia, of Soviet Union, is based on this imitation, but creative imitation, I would say, because you have a very uncreative imitation of the West. I think in Romania, I'm also Romanian, ethnic Romanian citizens, so I have the right to self-criticism. Listen, I lived for 5 years in Romania. I know that. So we are Romanian-speaking Romanians, but having very, very different, let's say, old views and hierarchy of values and so on and so on and so on. More like Austrians and Germans and Swiss, kind of sharing the same language, but you know, being very different in terms of identity because of this ingredients, different ingredients of relationship between also some Ukrainians and Russian Slavs in general. So the West is there, it's contradiction. And actually my late father did his military service in Jelgava near Riga, and I was struck, you know, I was 10 or 12 when I have heard this discussion that, you know, when he entered a shop in Riga in early 70s, the seller did not want to talk to him in Russian. He was kind of you know, he could not believe it, you know, Soviet Union, and myself as well. What is going on there, you know? And then he understood that you should go to the shop and say something in other languages, not Russian, and then they are willing to switch to Russian if they know that you are not Russian. And another story about Kazakhstan, you know, in the 80s, it was a wedding in my village, and somebody from Kazakhstan, from the you know, Tsarina period of the 50s, remained there and came back, and they told us stories like, you know, during the harvest, the grain harvest in the summer, yeah. He was a driver and said, I'm tanking the car, I'm filling the car with the grain, and on the way to the village, I decide to go to the kolkhoz warehouse, or to go to my place, or to the neighbors. And my conclusion, I was 12, 13, something like that. I said, there is no Soviet power, нет советской власти в Kazakhstan. It's kind of koshmar. So it was the first time, my first experience when I realized this kind of difference in experiencing what was the Soviet power was about in different parts of the world. And shortly here in 74, there was a 15th anniversary from the creation of Soviet Moldavia, meaning the autonomous republic, to be kind of, semi-century. And a lot of people came from different republics, including from Russia, from Siberia especially. And they were amazed of the level of welfare in Moldova. It was 74. They visited villages and so on and so on. They impressed with the number of the poultry and cattle and, and houses very well in comparison with the experiences. And they even said, whoa, we were told we are building communism, but you are already living in communism. And it was a saying that even Brezhnev said, "Бедный русский народ." So it's kind of what is happening. So I think it's about kolkhoz is kolkhoz, but a lot depends on the cultural stuff that you have that, and including the kulaks, deported in Siberia. And they recreated their welfareness in Siberia. In 2 years, they got bigger houses, kind of a lot of cattle and all this stuff, and they were, the Soviet authorities we deported them to, to punish them. You cannot eradicate this kind of idea of being rich and something like that. So it's an idea here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And also I can say that we can use this pejorative understanding of the West in case of Western Ukraine. Zapadnaya, where it was often used in Soviet Ukraine by Russophones as a sort of negative term.
Especially
they're from Western Ukraine.
So meaning nationalist as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So and now let me just go to Professor Cusco and ask you for your replies. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, and many thanks to Professor Kuromia for his comment, which I'd like to respond to. Yes, well, of course, you are right. So it was not my intention to say that Bessarabia was exceptional in this sense in the late 19th and early 20th century. On the contrary, it fit perfectly into this larger pattern that we see, let's say, in Southwest Russia, not only Southwest Russia, speaking territorially. It was not exceptional in this sense at all. Rather, it was exceptional in the sense that the Moldavian peasantry, which spoke a different language, was quite successfully, targeted by parties such as Soyuz Ruskого Naroda not on a linguistic basis, but rather on the basis of dynastic loyalty, common orthodoxy, and that kind of more traditionalist agenda. So in this regard, of course, I have nothing else to add. But I would like to emphasize that where I do find Bessarabia to be exceptional, and maybe I wasn't quite clear because of lack of time, is in the other two dimensions, right? So the first is, again, if I'm speaking about this period, that it was contested directly by another nation state, that is Romania, which was not quite usual in the Russian context, at least, at that time. And secondly, because of this Ismail anomaly, which introduced a degree of institutional differentiation in the province at a time when ostensibly the Russian government strove towards centralization. But I think what the more important and general point might be about the Bessarabian case as a relevant instance of Russian management of the peripheries was that it confirms the conclusion that there in fact was never a consistent and coherent central policy regarding the borderlands, even the Western borderlands, if we include Bessarabia into that category. So this inconsistency and incoherence is quite manifest also in the Bessarabian case in this period, when we see quite contradictory signals from the center, and even the local actors who ostensibly claim they represent the center, like this Bishop Serafim Chichagov, often have very idiosyncratic agendas that do not really completely, reflect the priorities of this imperial center and so on. So this inconsistency is quite obvious in Bessarabia.